So my presentation today is a little bit more general. I'm coming from the perspective of a contractor who works with private landowners. So generally what I'm doing is meeting with people who call PlantWise or call me directly to come walk around their property with them and say, what can I do? What's here? What's the right thing? And how do I fit my vision for this piece of property that I own into what the right thing to do is? And you'll see my title, I use pretty careful wording. I call it caring for the land, and I call people landholders rather than landowners. I have a lot of people who call, for instance, that condo association charity that you were talking about, places like that, that maybe they have a mitigation requirement, maybe they're genuinely looking for the right thing to do. The spectrum is pretty broad in terms of who I'm talking to. Let me see, how do I switch my slide here? So in general, I'm showing up as a consultant to say, let's talk about what's possible. Let's talk about what you are really interested in doing. Um, as Kyle said, I'm sorry, is it Kyler? Yes, as Kyler said, I am the landscape designer and project manager for PlantWise. I also function as the burn boss during our prescribed burn season. So PlantWise does a lot of different aspects of land management. We start with consultations, we do plant surveys, we then implement the work, we do invasive species control. I do landscape designs for people who want, formal beds, anything from formal beds to a prairie seeding. And then we do maintenance and care and monitoring. I'm also a caretaker at Reichert for Legacy, along with my partner and his son. We've been here for a couple of years and really love it on the property. So I get to do some non consultation style work, which is wonderful. And then I'm an artist as well. I work with a gallery out of Grand Rapids, and most of my work is based on my time in the field. So I've been with PlantWise for 10 years and have spent a lot of time doing a lot of different styles of work with them. So generally, what I'm initially doing is showing up on someone's property and saying, let's talk about your land from this stewardship perspective rather than this ownership perspective. There's a quote that I really like about switching your perspective from thinking about what are the rights that I have as a landowner versus what are my obligations to the land as a steward. This can make a really big difference in thinking about how you'll incorporate what's interesting to you about the piece of property and what's important to you about your family's use of the piece of property during your lifetime in a broader vision of beyond your lifetime and leaving that land better than you found it. But I do feel like it's very important to incorporate that vision that you have for your use of the property, your aesthetic vision of the piece of property, and how involved you might be in the long-term maintenance in doing the right thing. Because often what happens is people will call me, I'll show up and start saying, you have this beautiful wetland, you have this degraded woodland, and it gets really overwhelming when I'm going through all these different habitats and ecosystems, and people start to feel the weight of this obligation or responsibility for this piece of property. So then what I'm hoping to do when I'm there is really incorporate personal vision in that piece of that perspective of I want to do the right thing and I want to do the right thing for the pollinators and the birds. My work as an artist and my work in land management is really centered on incorporating that idea of home and that idea of it is a place that I'm going to spend time in your management practices so that long term it's something that you'll be motivated to take care of and that you will be able to spend time with. One of the issues that I frequently run into with people calling us to discuss work and look at the piece of property is, I want to fix this and then I want to be done with it and I don't ever want to have to manage it again. And that, as many of you probably know from your experience, is an issue because there isn't really a one-time fix for things that, that can get you to a better place, and then you have to take care of it. And unless you're engaged with that piece of property, it's really hard to not only spend your money to do that, but to spend your time to really be observing the land and observing what happens after you do take those initial steps. Um, so one of the really important pieces I feel in choosing a contractor and choosing to work with somebody is really finding someone who is going to work with you to fit your vision into that planning rather than just try to sell you a single one hit project. So generally what that starts with is a survey or developing a management plan. And I don't do a lot of work with funding and grant work. I'm generally coming in prior to that or immediately after someone has looked into getting grant money and realized they need a management plan, or they've gotten a little overwhelmed with the process of um, how to make decisions on that with that piece of property, with what's the most important to take care of, and kind of what their vision is and fitting that together. So with PlantWise and as a consultant, I do surveys where we'll walk around the property and really assess what are the habitats and ecosystems that you have, which are the most ecologically valuable, and what species do you have that might be not only significant in getting some funding and getting a grant, but also are interesting to you. If you really like spending time in that wetland, let's focus on making sure that wetland is what we're protecting, because again, your involvement in spending time there is really going to impact long-term care. Also, one of the things that I work with a lot is water management on property. So if I'm showing up for instance, you have your backyard, and then you've got this old field property and old field acreage on the back of your property, and you want to talk about, this area is flooding. I don't I don't really know how to deal with this area. It's all reed canary grass. I want it to be more diverse. We come in and we really look at where that water is and how we can take advantage of where that water is and get some really nice diverse species in. And also, if it's close to a building, if it's something where you have a lot of impermeable surfaces, creating things like rain gardens and pollinator habitat that can process that water and really keep the water that you have on your property and process it there rather than sending it to the ditch between you and your neighbor's house. The next thing we do generally is discuss the threats to that diversity that you do have. So what invasive species do you have? Where are those boundaries between your high quality environments, your wetlands, your nice forests, and a patch of buckthorn or an area of degraded habitat where you have a lot of invasive species? And I can really, talk with landowners about, so if you don't deal with this place and you're putting all your energy into this place, this is kind of what you're going to be fighting. These are the species that are going to be a problem. Let's prioritize those. And that's really a significant part of the process, because often what people do is they come at it with limited experience, things we've read online that say, this species is invasive, this species is also invasive, and it's really hard to choose where to start. It can really become overwhelming and daunting. So that's where I come in with the experience that I've had and really help people prioritize things and decide when it's time to actually take action on a species. Because oftentimes you can have a population of something that you decide, I'm going to attack it because it's an invasive species, but it might not be the right thing to do. You might have something more pressing, or maybe that is something that we put off into the future and you use your budget for something that is more significant or closer to a more diverse habitat. That can include the population size and just saying, at what point do we treat it now because it's small enough that we don't have to think about it for too long after that, or do we let it continue to grow until it becomes a daunting issue and then we don't have the budget to deal with it? Within that is also the timing. So deciding when it's time to cut seasonally or when it's time to burn seasonally. based on your priorities, if you want to promote grasses versus wildflowers, timing can have a very huge impact when you do certain types of control on what the results will be. The other thing I do, and this is primarily for homeowners, new building, is determining potential areas for new habitat. So if someone's interested in putting in a prairie or not just improving what they have, but changing something, I can use design and my experience to incorporate native plants in that landscape. And just in general, finding opportunities to increase diversity throughout the property. What comes after that is doing the actual work. So this part of the process is really significant in terms of having a consultant or a contractor work with you who's experienced and can say, this is the right or wrong method based on the results that I would expect from what I'm seeing, whether it's your soil type, the history of the land, what your involvement is going to be long term. So if we're restoring what's there, we have to look at what the first point of action is. Are we going to do a big cutting and cut and paint project? And then what's next? Are we going to burn it? Are we going to mow it? Are we going to be spraying regularly? There's a lot of different ways to line up the potential practices for care and maintenance of land. And if you don't do that in a way that doesn't consider first your involvement and the time and money that you're going to be putting into this land, and second, what we expect to see based on what species are there. So if you're planning to cut in a vernal pond area with a lot of maple litter, and then you want to burn in coming years after that initial cutting, it's not going to work because likely that property is not going to be burning. You have to have the right species for different practices, particularly burning. And that can make a big difference in just choosing what practice to do so that you're not wasting your money. The other piece of that is choosing when to do something like an installation. So I have a lot of people call me and say, can we come and spray this off or solarize this and get rid of the species that are here and then do a planting in July? And the answer is you can, but generally what will happen is the species that we just treated a month ago are going to show up in another month. And I talk to people about extending that prep period, extending that care time prior to doing an installation so that it's successful and so that you can expect the plants that you put in to show back up the next year. And a big question that I'm always asking people and trying to put into the conversation is, are we doing more good than harm? And generally what I'm discussing here is disturbance. So every time you're changing anything on the land, even if it's a good thing, such as cutting and painting invasive species or spraying invasive species, you're essentially creating a disturbance. So those disturbances can be good in that they provide the opportunity for other plants to show up. But that really depends on what your seed bank is. If you're letting a lot of light into a new area and you don't have a seed bank of nice native plants, you need to think about what you're going to do in order to get some native plants in that area. So acknowledging that what you're doing is not only good, but it's also creating a disturbance. And so therefore your follow-up has to include the acknowledgement of that disturbance and decide how you're going to handle it. And sometimes that is seeing what happens because you know that there have historically been nice native species there. For instance, I did a restoration up in Arcadia Marsh with PlantWise years ago. We sprayed off acres and acres of reed canary grass, and we came back the next year and it was all blue joint grass and blue vervain. And that doesn't always happen. Oftentimes you end up with Canada thistle, more reed canary grass, more invasive species. So it really depends on what was there historically, what ends up happening. So just remembering that that disturbance is a significant part of the process, and and knowing how you're going to handle that. And long-term care monitoring is one of the most important pieces of that. As I said earlier, if you go in and you cut and you treat and you spray and you get it, to what feels like a really nice open woodland area, and then you just ignore it, what you're going to end up with is any number of seedlings and resprouts showing back up. If you're not on that property paying attention to what's happening next and responding to it, you're likely going to be back where you started within a few years. So long-term care is really something that needs to be considered from the beginning. Um, and oftentimes that can be, we've been burning it for 5 years, we're noticing that there have been some negative effects on these specific species. Let's either change when we burn it or maybe use a different practice for a little while and see how that can promote any kind of change in the results that we're getting. And that's really, those shifting methods are really, speaking to the fact that randomness in practice is actually a really good thing because we're working with natural systems. And if you can shift when your management is happening, you can really shift the results of that. Also considering long term, what's your budget? Have you left enough for the follow up in the next 5 to 10 years? And are you planning to do that yourself versus having a contractor do that? And if you're doing it yourself, I often recommend people to have a consultant come work with them to really teach them good practice and identification. This is especially important, I've found, in new plantings where people are used to really typical installations of, nursery plants and versus native plants that people aren't necessarily used to seeing pop up in spring and maybe feel are a little bit weedy looking from the start. So that involvement of landowners is extremely important in long-term care and follow-up. So another part of this is being really aware of who you're working with and trying to work locally. So when you're buying native plants, trees, seed, I can't stress enough the importance of working with somebody local. And this isn't just because you're supporting a local business. Generally, what people are using is local seed source, local stock, and that can make an impact on how successful those plants are going to be, how responsibly they're sourced. We are pretty cautious about where we get plants when we're doing plantings. And here is just a list in general of kind of the places that we use. There's a few others that I'll use if somebody is really interested in individual species that we can't find locally. And, I frequently have people tell me, well, I worked with this nursery from downtown and they sold me this native plant. And a lot of places now are selling cultivars, cultivated varieties of native plants as native plants, just because they don't have the experience. They don't recognize or understand that it's actually really important that you have a genuine native plant rather than something that, it's a cultivated black-eyed Susan that kind of looks like the native variety, but oh, this one stands up longer in the season. And so we got this one instead and we like it better. Well, that can have a huge impact on the insects and the birds and whether they're able to use those species for habitat or food or shelter. And then for seed, we often use Michigan Wildflower Farm. They are great about doing custom seed mixes. They also have listed seed mixes for different sources and needs. For instance, if you have clay soil or a lot of deer or wetlands, and they are great about shipping and talking to you if you need a little bit of consulting about what seeds to use. And then over here is also a list of just other contractors in the area that I have experience with. PlantWise, who I work with, Sean Zellers is my partner. He's also a caretaker at Reichert. He does consulting work with me. Mike Apple, Ferroflora, and Wild Type. So Ferroflora and Wild Type are both nurseries that also do some restoration work and consulting as well. And there is my contact information if anybody needs to get in contact with me. as well as PlantWise, which I recommend for burning, if you need any burning or other work. Let me see if I can see people again here. All right. Does anybody have questions? Let's
We've
see.
got one from Charity in the chat. She was asking, is there a national directory of local sources and contractors?
That's a good question. Most people find us through the Washtenaw County water resources or conservation districts. It's really, I found word of mouth is the best way, because working with someone who has worked with someone that you know and trust is generally kind of how you'll get fit with someone who's a good fit for what you're looking for. Yeah.
The Go Beyond Beauty program from Northern Michigan is certifying plant nurseries now for providing native to Michigan
Oh, that's great.
stock. So they have a pretty good program as far as they do trainings for nurseries and landscaping companies as well to kind of convert them from providing invasives to selling only native plants. So that's a helpful resource for that as well.
Yeah, it's been a really big thing lately as this has gotten more popular, where I have people say, so and so put this in for me and it's all native, and I look at the species and they're not, they're a butterfly weed that's pink flowering, and it stands 2 feet, 2.5 feet tall for most of the season and never flops over, and it's pretty, but it's not necessarily doing the same work. So yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate talking with you guys.